The German sergeant never saw it coming. One moment he was leading his patrol through the French countryside near a small village called L'Épinette, scanning the windows and rooftops for threats. The next moment, without any sound of a gunshot, he crumpled to the ground with an arrow lodged deep in his chest. His stunned comrades barely had time to register what had happened before machine gun fire erupted from multiple positions, cutting through their ranks. This was May 27, 1940, and standing in that tower overlooking the village was a British officer unlike any other in World War II. His name was Lieutenant Colonel John Malcolm Thorpe Fleming Churchill, and while the rest of the modern world fought with rifles, machine guns, and artillery, this man went into battle carrying a Scottish broadsword, a longbow with arrows, and a set of bagpipes. His fellow soldiers called him Mad Jack. The Germans who faced him likely had other names for him. And before you write this off as some tall tale spun up in a pub after the war, understand that every word of what you're about to hear has been documented, verified, and in many cases witnessed by dozens of men who fought alongside him. This is the true story of the only British officer confirmed to have killed an enemy soldier with a longbow in World War II, the man who captured 42 German troops armed only with a sword, and the soldier who escaped not one but two Nazi prison camps. If you're enjoying this story of one of history's most unconventional warriors, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more incredible World War II history. Jack Churchill was born on September 16, 1906, in Colombo, British Ceylon, now known as Sri Lanka. His father, Alec Fleming Churchill, worked as a district engineer in the Ceylon civil service, continuing a family tradition as his own father had served in the same capacity. Jack's mother, Eleanor Elizabeth, came from Irish stock, the daughter of John Alexander Bond Bell of County Cavan, Ireland. Shortly after Jack's birth, the family returned to Dormansland in Surrey, England, where his younger brother Thomas Bell Lindsay Churchill was born in 1907. In 1910, when Jack was just 4 years old, the family relocated again, this time to British Hong Kong, where his father had been appointed Director of Public Works, also serving as a member of the Executive Council. It was in Hong Kong that the youngest Churchill brother, Robert Alec Farquhar Churchill, was born in 1911. The three Churchill brothers would all grow up to serve in World War II, and all three would become known for their exceptional courage, though none would match Jack's reputation for sheer audacity. The family finally returned to England for good in 1917, when Jack was 11 years old. By then, the First World War was raging across Europe, and young Jack was growing up in a world that was rapidly changing, where the old codes of honor and chivalry were being ground into the mud of Flanders fields. Perhaps it was this contrast between the romantic notions of warfare from earlier eras and the industrial slaughter of modern combat that would later shape his unique approach to battle. Jack was educated at King William's College on the Isle of Man, a private institution with a strong tradition of producing military officers and colonial administrators. From there, he progressed to the Royal Military College at Sandhurst, Britain's premier academy for training army officers. He graduated in 1926 and was immediately commissioned into the 2nd Battalion of the Manchester Regiment, one of the oldest and most distinguished infantry regiments in the British Army. His first posting took him to Burma, which was then part of British India. It was during these years in Burma that Jack Churchill began to reveal the adventurous spirit and disregard for conventional behavior that would later make him legendary. While other officers spent their leisure time in the officers' mess, playing cards or reading, Churchill was out exploring the countryside on his motorcycle, often traveling hundreds of miles across terrain that barely qualified as roads. On one occasion, he rode his Zenith motorcycle 1,500 miles from Pune in India back to Calcutta, a journey that should have taken him through relatively civilized areas. But this was Jack Churchill, and civilized was never his style. Along the way, he got into a confrontation with a large and hostile water buffalo, losing that particular battle but somehow managing to limp back to his unit in time for duty. His adventures in Burma weren't limited to motorcycle expeditions. He developed a technique for crossing railway bridges that consisted of nothing more than open sleepers, gaps between each wooden tie where you could see straight down to the ground far below. Rather than sensibly avoiding these bridges, Churchill would step onto the sleepers and push his motorcycle along the rails, balancing it like some sort of circus performer while listening intently for any sound of an approaching train. It was during these years in Burma that he first took up the bagpipes, learning the instrument under the tutorship of the pipe major of the Cameron Highlanders. For an Englishman with no Scottish blood to master the bagpipes was unusual enough, but Churchill threw himself into it with characteristic intensity. He also participated in flag marches, traveling down the Irrawaddy River, Burma's largest commercial waterway, visiting villages to collect intelligence on suspected bandits. These operations gave him early experience in the kind of unconventional warfare that would later define his World War II career. Churchill served in Burma during the 1930 to 1932 Burma Rebellion, where local insurgents rose up against British colonial rule. For his service during this period, he was awarded the Indian General Service Medal with Burma Clasp, the first of many decorations he would earn over his military career. But by 1936, after a decade of military service, Churchill found peacetime army life increasingly dull. The endless drills, the paperwork, the garrison duty, all of it seemed to drain the life out of him. He wanted adventure, excitement, the kind of challenges that would test a man to his limits. And so, in 1936, he resigned his commission, though he remained on the regular Army Reserve of Officers list, just in case Britain ever needed him again. Churchill's civilian career was just as eclectic as his military service had been. He moved to Nairobi, Kenya, where he worked as a newspaper editor, a job that seemed impossibly ordinary for someone of his temperament. He also worked as a male model, his chiseled features and athletic build apparently making him quite photogenic. But it was in the world of entertainment that Churchill really began to make a name for himself. He appeared in small roles in films, most notably the 1924 film The Thief of Baghdad, where he was hired specifically to demonstrate his archery skills. He also appeared in A Yank at Oxford in 1938, again showcasing his unusual talents. Because by this time, Churchill had become an expert archer, practicing relentlessly with the English longbow, that medieval weapon which had once decided the fate of nations at battles like Agincourt. In 1938, Churchill took second place in the officers' class of the military piping competition at the Aldershot Tattoo, an extraordinary achievement considering he was the only Englishman among about 70 Scottish competitors. And in 1939, just months before the world would be plunged into another global war, Churchill represented Great Britain at the World Archery Championships in Oslo, Norway. He placed 26th overall, a respectable showing in an international field, but more importantly, it showed that Churchill had transformed himself into a genuinely skilled archer, someone who could hit targets at considerable distances with consistent accuracy. This wasn't just some hobby or affectation. He had put in the hours of practice, built up the arm strength, developed the technique to make the longbow a genuinely effective weapon in his hands. And then, in September 1939, Nazi Germany invaded Poland, and Britain declared war. Jack Churchill immediately rejoined the Manchester Regiment, and when someone at headquarters made a joke about how desperate things must be if they were calling up the bowmen, Churchill apparently just smiled. He was back in his red coat, as he would later say, the country having gotten into a jam in his absence. He was assigned to the British Expeditionary Force and shipped off to France, where he would finally get the adventure he'd been craving. What he brought with him to France, in addition to the standard kit issued to every British officer, were 3 items that would become his trademarks: his bagpipes, his English longbow with a quiver of arrows, and a Scottish basket-hilted claymore sword. Specifically a claybeg, the smaller one-handed version rather than the massive two-handed great sword most people think of when they hear the word claymore. Now, let's return to that moment in May 1940, near the village of Lepinette, because this is where the legend of Mad Jack Churchill truly begins. The British Expeditionary Force was in full retreat toward Dunkirk, with the German Wehrmacht pressing them hard from multiple directions. The Blitz had smashed through French and British defenses with shocking speed, and now hundreds of thousands of Allied troops were being pushed back toward the Channel coast, fighting desperate rearguard actions to buy time for the evacuation that would become one of the most famous episodes of the war. Churchill's company from the Manchester Regiment had taken up positions in and around Lepinette, and Churchill himself was in a tower overlooking the approaches to the village when he spotted a German patrol advancing in the distance. He could have simply ordered his men to open fire with their machine guns and rifles, but that wasn't Jack Churchill's way. He calmly took out his longbow, knocked an arrow, drew back the string, aimed carefully at the approaching Germans, and released. The arrow flew true, striking the lead German sergeant's center mass from a range of about 30 yards. The man collapsed without a sound. Churchill had given the signal for the ambush, and his two fellow infantrymen immediately opened fire with machine guns, cutting down the rest of the patrol. Now, I need to address something important here. Multiple sources report this incident, and it's been written about extensively. However, Wikipedia cites Churchill himself as later saying that his bows had been crushed by a lorry earlier in the campaign. Some historians have pointed out that the incident is mentioned in archery history books, and that there's a war diary from the 4th Infantry Brigade where Churchill served that references the action, but the specific mention of the longbow kill varies between sources. What we can say with certainty is that this incident at Lepinette became known as the last confirmed longbow kill by a British officer in warfare, whether or not every detail has been perfectly preserved in the historical record. What we know for absolute certain is what happened after the ambush. Churchill's company found themselves trapped, surrounded by German forces that vastly outnumbered them. Churchill took charge, personally manning machine guns until the ammunition ran out, all while directing his men in a fighting withdrawal. He was shot in the shoulder during the engagement, but refused to leave until every man who could be saved had been extracted. He led his men through enemy lines under cover of darkness, navigating by compass and instinct, through hostile territory until they reached British positions. For his actions at Lepinette, Churchill was awarded the Military Cross, one of Britain's highest decorations for bravery in combat. The citation praised his leadership, courage, and tactical skill in an impossible situation. The evacuation at Dunkirk was a chaotic nightmare, with hundreds of thousands of men crowded onto the beaches under constant air attack, waiting desperately for the small boats that would ferry them out to the larger ships offshore. In his diary, one soldier wrote about seeing Churchill on the beaches, and the entry captures something important about the man's effect on morale. The soldier noted that one of the most reassuring sights during the evacuation was Captain Churchill passing down the beach with his bows and arrows. In the midst of absolute chaos, with the German army closing in and the Luftwaffe bombing and strafing the beaches, here was this officer, calmly carrying medieval weapons, completely unflappable in the face of danger. It was exactly the kind of confident, almost theatrical display that reminded exhausted, frightened men that not everything was lost, that there were still officers who believed they could win this war. After being successfully evacuated from Dunkirk, Churchill volunteered for an entirely new type of military unit that was just being formed. The British commandos were conceived as elite raiders who would conduct lightning strikes against German-occupied positions, then vanish before the enemy could respond in force. The idea was partly to keep the Germans off balance, forcing them to divert troops to defend a long coastline rather than concentrating all their forces on offensive operations. But it was also about British morale after the disaster in France. The nation needed to see that they could still strike back, that they weren't simply cowering on their island waiting for the inevitable invasion. Churchill was a natural fit for the commandos. His appetite for aggressive action, his willingness to take risks, and his ability to inspire men made him exactly the kind of officer the commandos needed. His younger brother Thomas also joined the commandos and would eventually rise to the rank of Major General, leading commando brigades throughout the war. Tom Churchill would later write a book called Commando Crusade, which detailed some of their wartime experiences. The youngest brother, Robert, known as Buster, served in the Royal Navy and Fleet Air Arm. Tragically, Buster was shot down and killed in action on August 12, 1942, while flying from the aircraft carrier HMS Victorious during Operation Pedestal, a crucial convoy mission to resupply Malta. Before his death, Buster had managed to destroy 2 heavily armed Italian reconnaissance aircraft, fighting to the end. All 3 Churchill brothers were warriors, but Jack's methods would prove to be in a category entirely their own. On December 27, 1941, Churchill participated in Operation Archery, one of the most successful commando raids of the war. The target was the German garrison on the Norwegian island of Veagsø, along with the nearby island of Mjølløy. The Germans had established significant positions there, including coastal batteries, and were using the area as a staging point for convoys moving through the inner lead, the sheltered waterway along Norway's coast. The area also contained fish oil factories that the Germans were using to produce glycerin for explosives. The raid was led by Lieutenant Colonel John Durnford Slater, with Churchill serving as second in command of No. 3 Commando. It was also the first true tri-service operation, combining Royal Navy ships, Royal Air Force bombers and fighters, and Army commandos in a coordinated assault planned from the beginning, with all three services working together. The force sailed from Scotland on Christmas Eve 1941, passing through rough seas before arriving off the Norwegian coast, just before dawn on December 27th. As the landing craft approached the shore, Jack Churchill, standing at the front of his craft, began playing the March of the Cameron Men on his bagpipes. This wasn't just showing off, though it certainly was that. The bagpipes served multiple purposes. They rallied his own men, giving them an audible signal to follow and pumping them up for the fight ahead. They also had a profound psychological effect on the enemy. Imagine you're a German soldier, half awake on a cold Norwegian morning, and suddenly you hear bagpipes wailing across the water, growing louder as landing craft approach through the dawn mist. It's disorienting, terrifying in its strangeness, making it harder for the enemy to think clearly and react effectively. As the ramp dropped, Churchill leaped off playing his pipes, then pulled out a grenade, hurled it forward, drew his sword, and charged directly at the German position, screaming for his men to follow. The assault on Maloy Island was swift and brutal. Churchill and his commandos overran the battery in less than 10 minutes, killing or capturing all the German soldiers they encountered. Film footage from the raid, which still exists today, shows Churchill after the battle, standing on the deck of one of the ships playing his bagpipes while the rest of the commandos dance a Highland fling around him. It's a surreal image, these warriors celebrating their victory with Scottish traditional dancing while smoke still rises from the burning German installations on shore. The raid was a complete success. The commandos destroyed the German garrison, demolished the coastal batteries, blew up the fish oil factories and glycerin production facilities, sank several German ships, and brought back over 100 German prisoners. They also evacuated about 70 loyal Norwegians who wanted to join the Free Norwegian forces, and captured several Quislings, Norwegian collaborators with the Nazi occupation. British casualties were relatively light, though tragedy struck when a disabled RAF bomber accidentally dropped a phosphorus bomb on one of the landing craft, killing or badly burning nearly half the men aboard. But the strategic impact of the raid far exceeded its tactical results. Adolf Hitler, convinced that Britain might launch a full-scale invasion of Norway, diverted 30,000 troops to defend the Norwegian coast, troops that might otherwise have been sent to the Eastern Front where they were desperately needed. For his role in Operation Archery and his earlier actions at Lepinette, Churchill was awarded the Military Cross and Bar. His reputation was growing. Fellow commandos began telling stories about Mad Jack, about his insistence on carrying his sword into battle, his famous declaration that any officer who goes into action without his sword is improperly dressed. But these weren't just colorful eccentricities. Churchill was proving himself to be an exceptionally effective combat leader. He had an instinctive understanding of infantry tactics, a willingness to lead from the front that inspired absolute confidence in his men, and a creative approach to problem solving that came from thinking about warfare in ways that broke all the conventional rules. By July 1943, Churchill had been promoted and was now commanding No. 2 Commando. He led his men in the invasion of Sicily and then in the landings at Salerno on the Italian mainland. The fighting in Italy was some of the most brutal of the entire war, with German forces making the Allies pay in blood for every mile of Italian soil. At Salerno specifically, the Germans launched a massive counterattack aimed at driving the Allied forces back into the sea. Some Commando was attached to the 46th Infantry Division, fighting as regular infantry rather than in their usual raiding role. For 5 straight days, Churchill and his men were locked in intense combat, holding defensive positions against determined German assaults. Then came the moment that would cement Churchill's legend. The Germans had established observation posts in the hills overlooking the Salerno beachhead, and these positions were directing devastating artillery fire onto Allied forces below. Churchill was ordered to take out a particularly troublesome German observation post outside the town of Molina. The terrain was nightmarish. Steep hills covered in terraced vineyards, rocky ground, and heavy undergrowth that made movement difficult and prevented any hope of approaching silently. Conventional doctrine would call for a stealthy night raid by a small team, but Churchill looked at the situation and made a different calculation. He decided to bring nearly his entire force, organizing them into 6 parallel columns. The columns were spaced close enough to support each other, but far enough apart that they wouldn't bunch up and become easy targets. To solve the problem of the columns staying coordinated in the pitch-black night and avoiding firing on each other, Churchill gave a brilliantly simple order. Every 5 minutes, everyone would shout commando as loud as they could. For the German defenders dug into those hills, it must have been absolutely terrifying. They heard Allied forces taking a nearby hill under heavy artillery bombardment as night fell. Then, in the darkness, they started hearing hundreds of voices shouting commando from multiple directions, the sound echoing off the hills, making it impossible to tell how many attackers there were or where they were all coming from. It created a sense of being completely surrounded, outnumbered, overwhelmed. The attack swept over the German positions, and Churchill and his men secured all their objectives, capturing 136 prisoners total. But the most remarkable capture happened separately from the main assault. After the successful attack, Churchill and a single corporal, a man named Raffel, decided to go for a walk. They headed toward the town in the darkness, guided only by the glow of a cigarette from a German guard crew. Moving silently through the vineyards, they approached the first sentry position. Churchill suddenly stood up to his full height, his sword gleaming in the faint moonlight, and barked out Hände hoch, the German command for hands up. The two sentries, confronted by this fearsome apparition with a sword, immediately surrendered. Churchill gave one prisoner to Corporal Ruffel to guard. Then he slipped his revolver lanyard around the neck of the second sentry and led him forward to the next guard post. At each position, the captured sentry would call out in German that everything was fine, just the regular patrol making rounds. The unsuspecting guards would emerge from their positions only to find themselves facing Mad Jack Churchill and his gleaming sword. Post by post, they worked their way through the German defenses. They captured an entire 81mm mortar crew, 10 men clustered around their weapon. Churchill simply appeared out of the darkness with his sword drawn, and the Germans immediately laid down their weapons. By the time Churchill and Corporal Ruffel made their way back to British lines, they had captured 42 German soldiers, including a complete mortar squad with their weapon. Churchill had all the prisoners carrying their own weapons and equipment, though he had removed the rifle bolts and put them in a sack that one of the prisoners carried. The Germans also carried all the mortar ammunition they could manage, and they pulled a farm cart containing 5 wounded prisoners. As Churchill later explained it, you just tell Germans loudly and clearly what to do, and if you're senior to them, they'll cry Jawohl and get on with it enthusiastically and efficiently. It was, in Churchill's words, like an image from the Napoleonic Wars. This line of prisoners carrying their weapons and pulling carts through the night, escorted by 2 British soldiers. He received the Distinguished Service Order for this action, though some felt he should have been awarded the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest military decoration. When asked about it, Churchill simply noted that he always brought his prisoners back with their weapons because it weighed them down. After one engagement, Churchill realized he'd lost his sword in hand-to-hand combat and walked back through the battlefield to retrieve it. On his way back, he encountered an American patrol that had gotten disoriented and was walking directly toward German lines. When Churchill tried to redirect them and the NCO in charge refused to turn around, Churchill told him he was going his own way and wouldn't be coming back a bloody third time. That phrase, coming back a bloody third time, captured something essential about Churchill's approach to command. He would lead, he would help, he would risk his life for his men and even for allies who weren't under his command. But he wouldn't waste time arguing with fools, and he expected people to have some basic level of competence and common sense. In 1944, Churchill was sent to Yugoslavia to support Josip Broz Tito's partisan forces, who were fighting a brutal guerrilla war against the German occupation. Churchill's role was to coordinate between the British commandos and the Yugoslav partisans, providing training, leadership, and support for raids against German positions. In May 1904, he was ordered to lead a raid on the German-held island of Brac in the Adriatic Sea. The Germans had established fortified positions on the island, and there was concern they might be building an airfield that could threaten Allied operations. Churchill organized what he called a motley army, about 100 Yugoslav partisans along with 43 commando and 1 troop from 40 commando, a force of several hundred British soldiers. The initial landing on Brac was unopposed, the commandos and partisans coming ashore without resistance, but as they moved inland, they spotted German gun emplacements overlooking their positions. The partisans, who had been doing most of the fighting in Yugoslavia and had every reason to be cautious about attacking fortified positions without proper support, decided to defer the attack until the following day. Churchill's bagpipes signaled the British commandos to move forward anyway. The Germans opened fire, and Churchill wisely decided to pull back for the night and relaunch the attack the next morning. When that attack went in, Churchill led from the front as always, with elements of 43 Commando conducting a flanking attack, while Churchill led men from 40 Commando in a direct assault. The terrain was terrible. The German positions were strongly fortified with wire, mines, and machine guns, and the attack quickly bogged down. Only Churchill and 6 other commandos managed to fight their way to the objective, a hilltop position designated Point 622. They were pinned down on that hilltop, taking casualties from German machine gun fire and grenades. And then a German mortar crew began dropping rounds on their position. One of those mortar shells landed directly in the small area where Churchill and his 6 men had taken cover. The explosion killed or badly wounded everyone except Churchill himself, who was standing slightly apart from the others. He'd been playing Will Ye No Come Back Again on his bagpipes, that mournful Scottish tune, when the mortar round hit. The concussion from the blast must have been tremendous, and then German soldiers began lobbing hand grenades at his position. One of those grenades exploded close enough to knock Churchill unconscious. When he woke up, he was a prisoner of the Germans. The Germans searched him and found identity papers with the name Churchill on them. Given how famous Winston Churchill was, the German intelligence officers immediately suspected they might have captured someone important, possibly a relative of the British Prime Minister. Churchill was flown to Berlin for interrogation, where he was questioned extensively about his relationship to Winston Churchill. He truthfully told them he wasn't related, that Churchill was simply a common English surname, but the Germans didn't seem entirely convinced. After interrogation in Berlin, he was transferred to Sachsenhausen concentration camp. Not to the main camp, but to a special section reserved for prominent prisoners and anyone the Nazis thought might be useful for propaganda or as bargaining chips. Sachsenhausen was a horrific place, one of the major Nazi concentration camps where tens of thousands of people were murdered. The special compound where Churchill was held was called the LONGBOW, a section of about 80 cells that housed various VIP prisoners, including some of the most persistent Allied escapees, German political prisoners, and various others the Nazis wanted to keep alive for potential future use. Among Churchill's fellow prisoners were 3 Royal Air Force officers who had survived the Great Escape from Stalag Luft III and had been sent to Sachsenhausen rather than being executed like 50 of their fellow escapees. These men included Squadron Leader Bertram Arthur Jimmy James and Wing Commander Harry Day, both legendary escape artists who'd made multiple attempts from various prison camps. With cellmates like these, escape was virtually inevitable. In September 1944, just a few months after his capture, Churchill and the 3 RAF officers executed an escape plan they'd been working on. Using small cutlery knives and any other tools they could scrounge, they dug a tunnel over 110 meters long, a back-breaking effort given the limited time they had to work and the need for absolute secrecy. One night in late September, the 4 men crawled through their tunnel, emerged outside the camp perimeter, and set off on foot toward the Baltic coast, about 200 kilometers to the north. They split into pairs, Churchill traveling with one of the RAF officers. For several weeks they were on the run, sleeping rough during the day, traveling at night, scrounging for food, always aware that recapture meant almost certain execution. They made it to within a few kilometers of the Baltic coast near the town of Rostock. Freedom was so close they could probably smell the salt air from the sea, but their luck ran out. They were spotted, pursued, and recaptured. Churchill was interrogated again, and this time he was transferred to what the Germans considered a more secure facility. But even this new camp couldn't hold him. In April 1945, as the Red Army closed in from the east and the Western Allies pushed into Germany from the west, the SS began evacuating prominent prisoners from camps that were about to be overrun. Churchill and about 140 other high-value prisoners were transferred to Tyrol in Austria, an alpine region that some SS officers apparently thought might serve as a last redoubt for the Nazi regime. The group was guarded by SS troops, and the prisoners were terrified they would be executed rather than allowed to fall into Allied hands. A delegation of prisoners managed to contact senior German army officers, Wehrmacht rather than SS, and explain their situation. A German army unit under Captain Richard von Alvensleben moved in to protect the prisoners. There was a tense standoff between the Wehrmacht and the SS, but the army unit had more men, and the SS, seeing which way the wind was blowing, eventually withdrew and left the prisoners behind. The German army unit then departed as well, essentially freeing the prisoners but not formally liberating them. In the chaos, Churchill saw his opportunity. Taking advantage of a power outage one evening, he slipped away into the forests of the Tyrolean Alps. For 8 days, he walked, hobbled, really because he'd sprained his ankle, making his way through the mountains toward Italy. He hopped trains when he could, moving from one remote Alpine station to another, always heading south. Finally, near the Brenner Pass, he was spotted by an American reconnaissance unit. They must have thought he was some kind of apparition. This tall, thin British officer, limping badly, emerged from the mountains carrying nothing but his determination to get back to the war. Churchill was returned to Britain, debriefed, given a brief period of rest, and then, because the war in Europe had ended, but fighting was still raging in the Pacific, he was sent to Burma. The British were conducting some of the largest land battles against the Japanese in Southeast Asia, and Churchill was assigned to command a commando brigade that would participate in those operations. He traveled by ship to India, and during the voyage he no doubt thought about the combat to come, about leading his men into battle once again, about using all the hard-won lessons from fighting the Germans to defeat the Japanese. He arrived in India just in time to hear that atomic bombs had been dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Japan had surrendered unconditionally. The war was over. For most people, this was joyful news, the end of years of bloodshed and suffering. For Jack Churchill, it was a profound disappointment. He was quoted as saying, "If it wasn't for those damn Yanks, we could have kept the war going another 10 years. Now, he almost certainly said this with at least some tongue-in-cheek humor, the kind of dark joke that soldiers make. But there was probably a kernel of truth in it too. Churchill thrived in combat. The intensity, the challenge, the life-or-death stakes, these were what brought him fully alive. But Churchill's story didn't end with World War II. In 1946, he appeared in the film Ivanhoe alongside his old rowing companion Robert Taylor. The studio specifically hired Churchill to play an archer, shooting from the walls of Warwick Castle, putting his genuine medieval combat skills on display for the camera. He qualified as a parachutist at age 40, transferring to the Seaforth Highlanders, and later served as second in command of the 1st Battalion, Highland Light Infantry, in British-occupied Palestine. And it was in Palestine, in the spring of 1948, just before the end of the British Mandate and the establishment of Israel, that Churchill would perform one final act of heroism that deserves to be remembered. On April 13, 1948, a medical convoy was traveling from Jerusalem to Hadassah Hospital on Mount Scopus. The convoy consisted of 2 ambulances, 3 buses carrying doctors and nurses, and 3 trucks with supplies, escorted by 2 Haganah armored vehicles. At about 9:45 in the morning, the convoy was ambushed by Arab forces in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood. A mine exploded under the lead vehicle, and then machine gun fire and Molotov cocktails rained down on the trapped convoy from both sides of the narrow road. 2 of the buses were hit with firebombs and erupted in flames. People trying to escape the burning vehicles were shot as they emerged. The fighting continued for hours, with the convoy completely surrounded and taking casualties from all sides. Major Jack Churchill was stationed at a small British outpost called Tony's Post, not far from where the ambush was taking place. When he heard the firing, he immediately took a dingo armored car, actually just a scout car with its turret removed for repair, and 12 of his men, and drove straight into the ambush. He arrived to find absolute carnage, burning vehicles, dead and wounded lying in the street, and hundreds of Arab fighters maintaining a constant barrage of fire. Churchill walked up and down the convoy, completely exposed to enemy fire, offering to evacuate people in his vehicles. But the Jewish doctors and medical staff refused his help. They told him the Haganah would come to save them, that they didn't need British assistance. Churchill explained that he had only 12 men against hundreds of attackers, that the Haganah might not arrive in time, that people were dying right now and needed to be evacuated immediately. But the answer remained no. One of Churchill's men was mortally wounded during this time, shot while Churchill was negotiating with the convoy members. Churchill finally had to withdraw his small force, but from his outpost he and his men provided what covering fire they could, trying to suppress some of the Arab positions. But it wasn't nearly enough. The Haganah rescue force that the convoy had been counting on never arrived. By the time British forces finally intervened in force late in the afternoon, 79 people were dead, including doctors, nurses, students, patients, and one British soldier. 23 of the dead were women. Many bodies were so badly burned they could never be identified and were buried in a mass grave. It was called the Hadassah Convoy Massacre, and it was one of the worst atrocities of the Arab-Jewish violence during the final days of the British Mandate. But Churchill's role in that terrible day wasn't finished. After the massacre, he coordinated the evacuation of about 700 Jewish doctors, students, and patients from the Hadassah Hospital on Mount Scopus, which was now completely cut off by Arab forces and couldn't be safely reached by normal convoys. A journalist named Julian Lewis Davis later described riding with Churchill up to Mount Scopus. Davis was terrified, but Churchill stood in the jeep twirling his walking stick as they drove, looking for all the world like he was on parade in London, rather than driving through hostile territory where snipers could take a shot from any window. That was Jack Churchill in a nutshell. Unflappable, theatrical, completely confident in his own ability to handle whatever came his way. After his service in Palestine, Churchill continued in the military for several more years. He worked in Australia as an instructor, and it was there that he took up surfing, becoming quite good at it, despite being in his 40s. In 1955, he became the first person to ride a tidal bore wave on the River Severn for over a mile, designing and building his own 16-foot surfboard, specifically for the attempt. This demonstrated that surfing wasn't limited to ocean waves, helping to popularize the sport in inland areas where tidal bores occurred. He finally retired from the military in 1959 at age 53, settling into a quieter life, though quiet is a relative term when discussing Jack Churchill. In retirement, he developed a passion for restoring and operating coal-fired steamboats on the Thames between Richmond and Oxford. He also built radio-controlled model warships, applying the same meticulous attention to detail that had made him such an effective combat officer. He continued riding motorcycles well into his later years, and he maintained a habit that never failed to startle his fellow commuters on the train. Churchill would sit quietly reading his newspaper or looking out the window, and then suddenly stand up, open the window, and hurl his briefcase out into the darkness. Other passengers would stare in shock, wondering what on earth had just happened. What they didn't know was that Churchill had timed it perfectly, so the briefcase would land in his own garden, saving him the trouble of carrying it from the station to his house. It was a small gesture, but so perfectly Churchill, unconventional, slightly mad, but ultimately quite practical if you thought about it from his perspective. Churchill married Rosamond Margaret Denny on March 8, 1941, the daughter and granddaughter of prominent shipbuilders. They had two sons, Malcolm John Leslie Churchill, born in 1942, and Rodney Alistair Gladstone Churchill, born in 1947. According to Malcolm, his father didn't brag about his wartime exploits at all, but he would happily talk about them if asked, particularly if the conversation took place over a couple of nice glasses of wine in the evening. At home, Malcolm said, his mother ran the house and his father was quite happy to have things quiet. The man who had charged into battle with a sword and bagpipes was in his domestic life, apparently content to let his wife take charge while he focused on his various hobbies and interests. Jack Churchill died on March 8, 1996, at the age of 89, in Surrey, England, not far from where he'd been born 90 years earlier. In its obituary, one British newspaper wrote, "Had Churchill not existed, it would have been impossible to invent him. No fictional hero with his story would seem credible." And that really captures the essence of Mad Jack Churchill. If you saw his story in a movie, you'd roll your eyes and complain that the character was too over the top, too unrealistic, that nobody would actually go into World War II armed with a longbow and a sword. But he did. He really did. And he didn't just survive, he thrived. He won multiple decorations for valor. He led successful operations. He inspired his men. He terrified the enemy. He captured dozens of prisoners, escaped from concentration camps, and saved hundreds of lives after the war ended. In March 2014, the Royal Norwegian Explorers Club published a book ranking the finest explorers and adventurers of all time, and they included Jack Churchill in that list. It's a fitting honor for a man who spent his entire life pushing boundaries, refusing to accept conventional limitations, insisting that there was always room for individual courage and flair even in the most mechanized, industrialized conflict humanity had ever seen. Churchill proved that one man with enough audacity, enough skill, and enough sheer bloody-minded determination could make a real difference even when he was carrying weapons that would have been outdated in the 100 Years' War. His story reminds us that wars are ultimately fought by individual human beings and that personality, character, courage, these things still matter even when armies are measured in millions and weapons can destroy entire cities. The longbow was obsolete. The sword was obsolete. The bagpipes were nothing more than noise. But the man carrying those weapons, the man playing those pipes, he was anything but obsolete. He was timeless, a warrior in the oldest and truest sense of the word. Someone for whom combat was not just duty, but a calling, an art form, a way of expressing something fundamental about what it meant to be fully, completely, dangerously alive. That was Lieutenant Colonel John Malcolm Thorpe Fleming Churchill, DSO and Bar, MC and Bar, Mad Jack, Fighting Jack. The last man to kill an enemy with a longbow in warfare. The officer who captured 42 Germans with nothing but a sword. The soldier who went to war with bagpipes and came home a legend. And if his story seems too incredible to be true, well, that's exactly what makes it worth remembering, worth telling, worth passing down to another generation that needs to know that such men once walked among us.